Covenant. This prompted House and his allies to create the Council on Foreign Relations as a means of controlling America's policymaking elite and steering it in the direction of internationalism, that is, toward world government. By 1939, the CFR was prepared for a second attempt to create a new world order. According to Gelb and Lake, in 1939, backed by Rockefeller money and encouraged by Secretary of State Cordell Hull, the Council established 4 planning groups to help shape the political, economic, and strategic objectives of the United States for World War II and its aftermath. Bear in mind, these war planning groups were created before Pearl Harbor, at a time when President Franklin Roosevelt was assuring American voters that the United States would stay out of Europe's wars. Those studies and the CFR members responsible for them were absorbed by the State Department, where they created the framework for the United Nations. Appropriately, the first Secretary General of the United Nations was Alger Hiss, a member of America's patrician elite who had the odious distinction of being both a member of the CFR and a communist spy on behalf of the Soviet Union. In the person of Alger Hiss, the 2 main branches of the international power elite, the CFR-dominated American establishment and international communism, intersected. Indeed, as a column in the November 19, 1996 New York Times observed, Alger Hiss has defined America's post-war foreign policy. Sam Tannenhouse, the author of the column, acknowledged that all the evidence shows that Hiss was a Soviet agent. However, the commentator insists that our present foreign policy is part of the legacy of that traitor. This is because Hiss, a self-described internationalist, was part of an emerging governing elite eager to renounce American isolationism. Writes Tannenhouse, to assess the legacy of Hiss, one need only consider the front pages on the day he died, the articles describing President Clinton's plans to intervene in Zaire and to keep troops in Bosnia. The particulars will be debated, but few will question their basic premise. America's founding fathers urged the young republic to avoid foreign entanglements and to preserve limited constitutional government at home. Alger Hiss, the communist who has defined America's foreign policy for the past 5 decades, was an enemy of the Constitution who sought to create a world government. Hiss was also the living symbol of the conspiracy's grand design, the convergence of the United States and Soviet Russia as a prelude to world government. In 1953, Ford Foundation President H. Rowan Gaither confided the convergence design to congressional investigator Norman Dodd during a conversation at the Foundation's headquarters in New York City. According to Gaither, he and others who had worked in the State Department and other federal agencies had been operating under presidential directives that required them to make every effort to so alter life in the United States as to make possible a comfortable merger with the Soviet Union. But if merger with the Soviets was the intention, how do we explain the so-called Cold War? The Cold War was essentially an elaborate shadowboxing match between elites who shared the same aspirations. It is true that hundreds of thousands of Americans died in Korea and Vietnam, that trillions of dollars were spent on military preparations, that tens of millions of people suffered under the very real tyranny of communism. However, amid all of these tragedies, the power elite in both the East and West proceeded inexorably with its long-term objective of creating the institutions of a world government. One of the most revealing summaries of this design was A World Effectively Controlled by the United Nations, a 1963 study jointly commissioned by the Pentagon and the State Department and written by CFR member Lincoln Bloomfield of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. The Bloomfield study envisioned the creation of world government sufficiently powerful in any event to keep the peace and enforce its judgments, possessing enforceable taxing powers, and its own international military force. Although national governments would be allowed to exist and make domestic laws, all states would be bound by compulsory jurisdiction of the World Court, and a significant UN presence would exist in all countries. Nations would be permitted to keep a residual armed force to maintain internal order, according to UN standards. But what would become of communism? Bloomfield predicted that communism would be preserved and tamed rather than defeated. In fact, he wrote that the destruction of communism would actually hamper the movement toward world government. If the communist dynamic were greatly abated, the West might well lose whatever incentive it has for world government. After all, he asked, If there were no communist menace, would anyone be worrying about the need for such a revolution in international political arrangements? However, according to the Bloomfield study, if the communists would agree, the West, meaning the power elite in the West, would favor a world effectively controlled by the United Nations. The remaining question is then how to transform and tame the forces of communism to the point where the present international system might be radically reshaped in order to create a world government through the UN. The ruling elite in the communist world has pursued its own version of the convergence design, which was revealed to the West by Anatoly Golitsyn, a high-level KGB official who defected to the West in 1961. Golitsyn revealed that between 1958 and 1960, the KGB created a long-term strategy intended to transform the Soviet Union from the West's mortal enemy into its strategic partner. By creating phony splits among its communist allies and puppet regimes, such as the supposed split between Russia and China, the Soviet ruling elite created opportunities for Western policymakers to cooperate with various communist factions. By alternating between periods of reform and violent crackdowns, the communist leadership created the illusion of internal divisions between moderates and hardliners in the Soviet leadership. American foreign policy elites were thus able to justify pro-Soviet policies as initiatives intended to strengthen the position of the moderates in the Soviet leadership. Golitsyn predicted in his 1984 book New Lies for Old that the Soviet elite would produce a Gorbachev-style reformer who would preside over the liberalization of the Soviet Empire. The Berlin Wall would be torn down. Poland and the other satellite nations would become independent. The Warsaw Pact would dissolve. The Soviet Communist Party itself would appear to renounce its power, and the stage would be set for a convergence between East and West. Beginning in 1989, the developments predicted by Bloomfield and Golitsyn began to take shape at an accelerated rate. The Berlin Wall was torn down. The nations of Central and Eastern Europe achieved nominal independence from Moscow. And in 1991, the Soviet Union itself was abolished, leaving behind the Russian Federation and the Commonwealth of Independent States. The Cold War was liquidated, and the ex-communist nations, particularly Russia, suddenly became the strategic partners of the United States. Golitsyn has continued to analyze current developments, and in his 1995 book, The Perestroika Deception, he renewed and amplified his warning. In 1984, I thought that in the event of Western resistance to Soviet strategy, the scenario of convergence between the Soviet Union and the United States might take the next half-century to unroll. Now, because the West has committed itself to the support of Perestroika, convergence might take less than a decade. American troops now train side by side with Russian troops for UN-mandated peacekeeping missions, such as the occupation of Bosnia. Membership in NATO has been offered to the former Warsaw Pact nations, and American servicemen now find themselves serving directly under UN authority, sometimes under the operational command of foreign military officers, and court-martialed when they refuse to do so. All of these ominous developments in our military have been made possible by the accelerating convergence of the U.S. and socialist Russia. Nor has the establishment neglected Red China, which, as Golitsyn points out, was one of the principal architects of the communist long-range strategy and is destined to become a primary Soviet partner in the future world government. In July 1997, Hong Kong, a free and prosperous island state, will be absorbed by Communist China. Tung Chee-hwa, who was selected by Red China's rulers to govern the hapless island when it is surrendered to communist control, was also the preferred candidate of the Clinton administration. President Tung, appropriately, is a member of the CFR's International Advisory Board. The Clinton administration was battered by revelations that Red Chinese intelligence has attempted to influence American policy through laundered political contributions to Bill Clinton's re-election campaign. However, as former presidential advisor George Stephanopoulos has admitted, the Clinton administration's chumminess with Communist China has little to do with these contributions and much more to do with the Council on Foreign Relations, of which Mr. Stephanopoulos is himself a member. In April 1997, the CFR conducted a seminar on joint U.S. Red Chinese business ventures. Heavyweight CFR members such as Henry Kissinger, Brent Scowcroft, Alexander Haig, and Dick Cheney, as well as scores of CFR members in Fortune 500 companies,